Chapter 8. A westerly wind was blowing the sky clear as Bullitt slid into his desk. The bell rang. First period, U.S. History, and they hadn't even seen McIntyre's nose since the second week of school. Rumor had it McIntyre was spending the semester between the faculty lounge and the local bar while Walker taught his classes. Walker usually gave them a minute or two to settle down while he checked off the roll. Then he got to work, taking quizzes, reviewing the reading, discussing. Bullitt stretched his legs out. Funny, nobody was having any trouble settling down that morning. Walker stood behind the big desk at the front of the classroom. He looked around. He seemed to be listening, standing there at the front, his eyes roaming. He looked young, permanently underfed, and had that wimpy beard, but he was doing okay. He seemed to know what he was talking about, and he kept shifting tactics on them, so he was always running things. He didn't give Bullitt any trouble either, no trouble at all. Bullitt didn't mind him. I see, Walker said. It looks like we'd better do some thinking about it. Bullitt didn't know what he was talking about. The rest of the class did. There was a restless movement, leaning forward at their desk, and a babble of voices rose on questions and arguments. What are they going to do about it? Who is responsible? I think it's just terrible. Just terrible. Serves him right, if you ask me. At the tail end of the outburst, a girl's voice wailed, I don't understand. I don't understand it at all. I don't understand what's happening. And another outburst began. Everybody knows how things go here. He asked for it. But what's going to happen now? Hold on, Walker called. Hey, wait a minute. Hold on, waving his hands up in the air until he had their attention. I said think about it. I haven't heard any thinking. What's to think about? We all know what happened, and we all know why. That was from Cheryl from the front row, sounding impatient and sure of herself. You know, Miss Haskins, one of the most rewarding things about history is that it teaches us how much we don't know. The case of Richard III is a good example. Do you know about Richard III? Nobody did. Nobody wanted to. Then I'll tell you, but not today. Mr. Tillman, do you know what happened? Bullitt shook his head. He wasn't about to be dragged into anything. But you can't use him for an example of anything. Bullitt never knows. He doesn't care. He doesn't pay attention to anything, Cheryl argued. Bullitt? Walker asked her. He looked at Bullitt, but not as if he had asked a question. Bullitt just stared back at him. He seems to know enough to pass the course, Walker said, so you can't say he never, can you? There's a lesson in that. So suppose we start with just what did happen. Facts. 4 whites jumped a black guy. There were 8 of them the way I heard it. I heard 5. Outside the parking lot. That's not on school property. And they beat him up. They were all kids, students, here. Nobody knows who they are. Yeah, but we can guess. They split before the cops, except the black. He couldn't move the way I heard it. His name's Tammer. Tammer Ships, is one of the black students interrupted until they'd all sat quiet. And they were wearing masks, I hear. Your guys. He hadn't done anything. He went into the student lounge. He's a student, isn't he? Yeah, but what? Walker asked into the uncomfortable silence. But everybody knows they don't go in there. They? Walker asked. Blacks. He knew. Everybody knew he was going to try something. There's no law. There's a law that says he can, in fact. Yeah, but everybody knows how we live with that. Cheryl's loud voice cut across the argument. Let's forget that. There's a law, and that is fact. Like there's a draft law. It's a law that forces people to do what somebody thinks they ought to do. What's important to me is I'm not in favor of 4-to-1 odds in a fight. 5, 8, whatever the number, Cheryl overrode them. What we're missing here is motive. Why? Why did this Tammer went in there? He knew, didn't he? She insisted across the room at the blacks. We all know, they answered. Then why did he try going in there, she demanded. There was a long silence. Walker outweighted it. Because, Cheryl finally continued, if you go looking for trouble and you find it, you'd have nothing to complain about. He's not complaining. It's you who's complaining, far as I can tell. He wasn't looking for trouble. He was looking for a place to sit down out of the rain. And you forgot to ask why your guys had to beat him up while you're asking why. We all know why there were 4 of them. There was another silence. Bullitt watched the class, watched Walker watching. A white boy changed the subject. What I want to know is what they're going to do about it. I mean, I figure I know why this Tammer went in there, and I think he's right. Well, I do, but I want to know what they're going to do about roughing somebody up. What do you think should be done? It wasn't on school property. Let it blow over. It won't happen again. You believe that? You know who they are, your guys, I bet. You've got to know. They broke the law, assault and battery. They should get thrown out of school. We would be, and you know it. This time Walker took over the silence. This isn't thinking you're doing. Start to finish, you're not thinking. You're judging. Do you know what I mean? They didn't. Motive may call for judgment, but the law is beyond that. A babel of protests arose. Laws just guarantee the status quo, the position of the people in power. You're confusing law with justice, Mr. Walker. You believe in the law? Laws can be wrong. Everybody knows that. He waved his hands again to silence them, and after a while they piped down, unsatisfied. He turned around and started writing on the board. These, in the days when heaven was falling, the hour when earth's foundations fled. That's poetry. This isn't English class. Shut up, you jerk. Followed their mercenary calling. Mercenary, that means money. I'm all for that. What does that have to do with anything? And took their wages and are dead. What kind of poem is that, Mr. Walker? At least it's not all about beauty and love. It's not even a poem. All it does is rhyme. It doesn't have the right language. What about heaven falling? That's a metaphor or whatever, isn't it? Heaven doesn't fall. Unless you're Chicken Little, they laughed. Walker ignored them and wrote on. Their shoulders held the sky suspended. They stood and earth's foundation stay. Ah, parallel structure. I get all I can take of this in English. Why doesn't he say anything? What's the point? What God abandoned, these defended. Now we know who the bad guys are. Unless God is the bad guy, how much longer is there till the period ends? Anybody got a watch on? And save the sum of things for pay. I get it so far. Let's see what the third stanza says. What do you mean you get it? The thing doesn't make any sense at all. It's not supposed to make sense. It's poetry. Think Walker's gone off the deep end? There was a third stanza. Walker wrote underneath the last words. Epitaph on an army of mercenaries. Housemen. Then he turned around. Well, he asked. They all kept their eyes on the board, not looking at Walker. Wow, Bullitt thought unwillingly. He caught Walker's pale eyes on him and wiped his face clean of expression. Finally, someone said, You didn't write the title at the end. You don't write the title at the end. It goes at the top. For a minute, Walker looked blank, and Bullitt hoped he would blow up, but he didn't. What side is Houseman on, he asked. You know what mercenaries are? Yeah, us in Vietnam. How does Houseman feel about mercenaries, Walker asked. They argued it back and forth, with Walker stepping in only when he had to say, We're not interested in how you feel about mercenaries, but with how Houseman feels. Bullitt didn't listen to the argument, which had nothing to do with him. He kept his eyes on the words chalked onto the board. An epitaph is what goes on a tombstone, he thought, cut in with a chisel, and boy, is that right for this. Shortly before the bell rang, Walker made his point. The poem is thinking as opposed to judging. Use it as a model, okay? Walker asked the class. Then, can anyone guess what Houseman did for a living? Soldier. Something physical. Athlete? Poet. Nobody earns a living as a poet, jerk. I think he was a mortician. I mean, it's very depressing. Big game hunter? Doctor? Lawyer? Indian chief? Walker shook his head solemnly. Mr. Tillerman, he asked. Bullitt stared at him. What do you want with me? Can you narrow it down? Do you think he was educated? Sure, Bullitt said. Why? Walker insisted. Teachers always do that. Use educated men as examples, Bullitt answered. It wasn't what Walker wanted him to say. He knew what Walker wanted him to say about the way you had to have worked on your mind to be able to do that, like you had to work on your muscles to bring your stride down exactly right. Walker seemed unoffended, but he told the class briefly that Houseman was a college professor who taught classics in England, and then that they could leave the room. But it's 5 minutes, they told him. He dismissed them anyway. Except Mr. Tillerman. Could I have a word with you? Bullitt stayed in his seat. Walker came over close to him. Now what? You liked it, didn't you? Walker indicated the board behind him. Bullitt shrugged. I want to talk to you, Walker said, because I don't seem to be able to make any connection with you. The other students don't seem to like you, although they don't dislike you. In fact, they respect you. None of this made any difference to Bullitt, but you had to look out for guys like Walker. They kept looking for ways to get inside you, and they weren't dumb. He kept his face deadpan, his eyes fixed on Walker's little pale eyes. Walker stood there. "How did you get a name like Bullet?" Walker asked. "I named myself, which is none of your business." A pale, foolish smile moved Walker's mouth. "Have it your way, but if there's anything you want to talk to me about, well, I just want you to know I'm here if you need to talk." Bullet stood up, impatient with this. He didn't have to stay and listen. "Because you don't strike me as happy," Walker said, "and I've got a class to get to," Bullet interrupted. He left the room before Walker could see that he was about to burst out laughing. The guy was a jerk, a smart jerk, but still, not smart, educated. Him and his beard and trying to get people to think. A few years of teaching would show him what was what. The cafeteria that day was quiet, but it hummed with the intensity of subdued conversations. Bullet sat down with the wimps, who shifted over to give him lots of room. They didn't know what to say after hello, and they were smart enough to keep quiet, keep their eyes down. Bullet ate and looked around. The usual, he thought. Tables of whites, tables of Negroes, the wimps occupying no man's land in between. Bullet noted missing faces among the whites. He scanned the tables to see if the big figure of Tammer Shipp was there. He thought he recognized the guy. He couldn't be sure, but he didn't think Tammer was in the room. That made sense, if he couldn't even move out of the cop's way, but he wondered about the whites. There were a few possibilities among the absentees. Flying low, probably. Bullet chewed, taking in the tension that filled the whole big room, just like the light from overhead fluorescent bulbs filled it, getting into every corner, flowing under the tables and showing the way feet were planted on the floor, ready to run, tense. Guys ate hunched over their trays, their eyes not on the people they were eating with, but scanning the room. Girls kept their eyes down, not looking at anyone, not talking much. "Gee," said one of the wimps, a scrawny 10th grader with thick glasses and a madre shirt, "I'm staying home for a few days." "How can you get away with that?" "My mom and dad will let me when I tell her. I'm not coming back here until it cools down." Chicken. When things blow up, it's people like us who really get trampled. If I were you, I'd have an asthma attack. They looked like they were having heart attacks right then, pale and rabbity. Bullet just ate his sandwiches, biting, chewing, swallowing. Part of the tension in the room was fear. You could taste it, dank and metallic, colored fear and white fear. Bullet slowly emptied the 2 pints of milk he'd gotten, slowly got up, slowly left the room. The next day, the luncheon jingled with heightened tension as Bullet moved unremarked to the wimp's table. Only a couple of 9th grade girls there, he noticed, and half a dozen little 8th graders. He was early to watch the room fill up. The long line by the server counter was moving along slowly, the people carrying their trays over to tables. Voices rang louder than usual. Ted Basin had a gap in his mouth where a couple of teeth used to be, and he was chewing cautiously. There were a couple of limping guys, a couple of black eyes. They'd got in a little trouble then. A big colored guy stood, looking around the noisy room. It was Tammer. Bullet recognized him. He'd remember him now. The guy had really heavy eyebrows. His face looked swollen, and he was moving as if hurt, but his glance all over the room was cool enough. The room was quiet, too quiet. Then it got noisy, too noisy. Bullet shifted his feet under the table. As if school wasn't bad enough the way it ordinarily was, he didn't need to spend his days in a war zone. But everybody was ready to panic. The whole room was ready to blow up around him. Tammer moved down the center of the room, heading for the back where some friends waved to him. He was nodding his head in greeting and going between 2 tables when he tripped and fell. The plate and silverware and metal tray rang on the cement floor. The milk carton fell under him and squished milk out all over his shirt. The room was so silent you could hear the bowl that held Jell-O ringing around and round and round until finally it rang around belly up and was quiet. Bullet watched, his hands relaxed on the table. Nobody spoke. The silence rang around the room. Most people hunched over their lunches like nothing had happened and nobody had noticed, except nobody was eating anything. Tammer got up slowly. His face had a gray-green undertone. Ketchup from the hamburgers was on his shirt front, mixed with milk. Jell-O hung off his cheek. Laughter, low, muffled, started on Bullet's side of the room. Bullet didn't move his eyes to see who it was. "Did you see that? Who got him?" Bullet shifted his legs out from under the confining table. For a minute, nobody moved, but there was a kind of growling noise somewhere. Then a bunch of blacks flashed into action, and from a nearby table, whites stood up to match them. Wooden benches scraped back on the floor. Voices cursed, called. People headed for the door, crowding and pushing. People closed in around the fight, pushing. Bullet caught a glimpse of Silver and moved. The whites were vocational track, and he knew how they liked to fight. He knew who their leader would be. He brought the leader down with a tackle that put the guy's wrist under Bullet's hand. He wrapped his fingers around the wrist while his shoulders pinned the guy to the floor. He closed his finger around the wrist until he felt the bones in there rubbing up against one another. The knife fell onto the floor, a black-handled switchblade. Bullet got up and dragged the guy after him, whipping his arm up behind his back and pushing hard. "What are you doing?" the guy asked. "Let go of me." Bullet didn't answer. Out of the corner of his eye, he saw a hand reach down for the blade on the floor. He slammed his foot down on the fingers, then covered the knife with his shoe. He spoke into his man's ear, loud so everyone could hear him. "Not in here." The last thing he wanted to put up with was a riot. That wasn't even clean fighting. There was a way to get your fighting in if you wanted to. These people just didn't know anything, he thought to himself in disgust. "What the—" Bullet jerked up, sharp up on the arm. "You hear me?" he asked. The head nodded. Bullet looked around at the rest of them, just staring at him. He looked across and saw only Tamer's back, where he faced a bunch of coloreds. Dark eyes glared at the boys among whom Bullet stood. "Sit down," Tamer said. "Ordered." Muttering, they obeyed him. Bullet let his man's arm down and spun him around to look into his sweating face. He didn't say anything, just stared into the guy's eyes until he was sure the message had gotten through, past the anger and past the fear pain brought. Then he turned and left the room. "Thanks, man," low voices murmured at his back.